Welcome, everybody. My name is David, also known as the Graceful Atheist. This is Chris, also known as Godless Journey. I wanted to just quickly introduce ourselves. In fact, I'm going to have Chris go first here and tell us about who you are and why you're here.
Well, I am Chris. I am a relatively new atheist. I dropped my religion probably about 6 or 7 months ago. Uh, was a long time in my church. Was in a lot of leadership roles and kind of slowly dissipated from that over a couple of years, and that. Um, Sorry about the echo. Um, that just kind of got me where I am. There's a lot of specifics that are kind of irrelevant. The biggest point, I guess, is that I'm here now. I met
That is a big
Dave.
point.
Yeah, met Dave on Twitter, and we decided to do this thing.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I think we have similar stories in that I participated in ministry for quite some time. Uh, in my personal experience, I kind of burnt out, but I remained a Christian for quite some time. And in 2015, the way I describe it is, I really couldn't maintain belief any longer. I couldn't the mental effort that it was taking to keep cognitive dissonance at bay was just overwhelming, and I came to the realization that I no longer believed. Both of us have started blogs to try to describe this process. What I think a number of people call the deconversion process. That's the term that I've chosen to use. And that is a good segue into what we'll be discussing today. So I recently wrote a blog post called "How to Deconvert," with a cheeky subtitle in 10 easy steps, and that's what we'll be discussing today. And I want to make clear right off the bat that I'm being somewhat facetious. I don't think there is a right way for this process to go. I don't think there's a particular order to the steps that you might experience, or that any one step will be exactly as described. This was an attempt to describe kind of the mental steps that I went through and that I've read or listened to other people's stories and that they've gone through. And then finally, I'd like to say that if your experience was different, I want to know. Part of why Chris and I are doing this is to try to begin some community to get people involved. And if you have a deconversion story and the steps you went through were totally different, send us our way. Send it in the comments on either of our blogs. You can contact us as well. So let's start. So the first step that I describe is what I call precipitating events. It's not a very creative step title, but what I mean by that is right before a precipitating event, basically your faith is pretty solid, right? You go around making statements like, "I know God exists. I know God loves me," and with no irony and no doubt in your mind. And precipitating events are, anything that would cause you to just pause for a moment and question that on any level. So you're on social media and someone from a secular or atheist perspective says something particularly witty and makes you think about it. Or in the worst cases, a tragedy occurs in your life and the silence of God is deafening. But first, I'm going to ask Chris. I put you on the spot here, Chris. Anything that you can describe as kind of these early precipitating events that were on the journey for you?
Yeah, I think the first thing that made me kind of pause and think about things was if and I had our first miscarriage. Um, I just remember the feeling of I put all this love, all this mental energy into having this baby, but then it didn't pan out. And the first thought I had was, if there is a God that is nothing but love, why would he cause this much pain? Not only to me, but to my wife, who physically went through the whole thing, leaving me completely helpless to do anything. And I remember, because it was kind of a weird time, because we went to one baby doctor's appointment and they're like, oh, it's behind by about 2 weeks. We're going to measure again in a week. And in that time we had a worship night at our church, and someone prayed for us, and like, oh, I just feel God saying life. And when we went back to that appointment, just to have that entire realization shattered, it made sense in my mind that there is a universe that is more chaotic than I was thinking. It didn't all make sense.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. Is brutally honest and deeply felt. And I think that is one of the things that we inside the bubble of faith that is not handled well, is when people experience real tragedy, real emotional hurt, and instead they get pat answers or I'm praying for you or what have you, and the real pain is not dealt with. So, man, that is a hard example of what we're talking about here. So,
and I still held on.
yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's the point, right? Like I'm saying, what we're describing here at this stage is really, really early. The very early things that start you to even if you're not consciously asking the questions, the guard has slipped just a little bit, right? I almost hesitate to talk about mine because they just pale in comparison to your experience, and I'm so sorry for you and your wife and what you had to go through.
Thank you. Didn't mean to steal your thunder.
No. I think that's exactly what I'm hoping for. This is to have real life examples of what we're talking about, and that is for real. For me, I think they were much more mundane, but rereading the Bible, actually rereading the entire thing as an adult, and here again, I mean, as a believer, I was reading it as a believer with faith, and yet for the first time, kind of allowing myself to read it with a modicum of skepticism, not even skepticism, just criticism, to say, wow, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't fit with the story of what it means to be a Christian. I reread Apologists, and in particular, a book called The Privileged Planet, which is from a couple of astronomers who wrote what is effectively an intelligent design book. And I thought, here's the smartest people I've read to date. And their arguments are terrible. So if these are the people that I'm supposed to look up to from an intellectual point of view for defending the faith, something is deeply, deeply wrong. And so that was some of the things that made me start to think. And again, at this stage, it's that cognitive dissonance starts to become an issue. It's not so much that you're thinking, oh, well, I'm going to abandon this today. It's just that, hey, I should think about that more, right?
Yeah.
Anything you want to add before we move on to the next stage?
No, that was definitely it for me.
Okay. All right. So the next stage that I describe is called critical mass, and what I mean by that is, if that precipitating events, if that first stage was just the beginnings, critical mass is when these things have been going on for some time, and there are multiple precipitating events happening simultaneously. They have stacked on top of each other. It's been getting harder and harder to keep all of these creeping doubts at bay. the idea here is it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It isn't that any one thing is completely overwhelming, but the combination of all of these things is starting to weigh very heavily. And at this point, you very much, at least for me, very much consider yourself a believer still, and you might even feel guilt for the doubts that you're experiencing. You might feel like, I'm not doing it right. I'm not reading my Bible enough. I'm not praying enough. I think, Chris, you're the one who made me put the quote in here about kind of calling out to God of, help, at this stage. Doubt's overwhelming. The something like your experience of just tragedy, asking for God to do anything at this point, say anything, just respond. And I think that's what I was trying to describe here.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was. It was we then had our son shortly after that, and we got pregnant again, and we had another miscarriage. And I think that one hurt even more than the first one. And I remember at that point, I spent probably an hour every morning just in prayer, just saying, God, say something, say anything. Just I need to hear you. I need some sort of validation to what's going on, why these things happen, why I feel the way I feel, why I am, doubting you. You've done all this incredible stuff for me, and all of a sudden it's gone. I don't understand. And that was a lot of time in there, and a lot of like you said, cognitive dissonance, and learned later on how much that hurt my wife. I didn't even realize it, just because she was having the same feelings, and I was putting up the front. Oh, no, God's fine. It's you just have to trust, and all the Christianese that goes into defending your own mind.
Right. Yeah, so much, man. Again, yours is a much more real example, and I know that many people, have any number of tragic events that happen, and just the failure for the church to acknowledge the reality of that hurt and that pain, in the defense of, oh, but you can't doubt God, right? Even in his silence, you can't doubt God.
Yeah. It's part of the plan.
Right. Exactly. Oh my God. The unintentional blaming of God by saying, God is in control, and God has a plan, and what does that do to a person? You've experienced this real life pain, and now you also have to grapple with, well, doesn't that make God responsible for the pain that I'm experiencing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Again, for me, I think it was a recognition of the things I mentioned before. It was I started to occasionally, on Twitter, I would see Roger Ebert, actually, who's kind of a famous atheist, and that was kind of my gateway drug. I would read Ebert's tweets and think, oh man, he's just an angry atheist, angry atheists, and I'd try to ignore him, but man, his arguments were on point. I couldn't debate them, and I spent a lot of time thinking about. I work in the technology world. I've got a handful of friends who are atheists, not hardcore, like. So they're not evangelistic atheists. They're not, angry atheists. But I knew they were atheists, and I was wondering, why. We've got real similar education, real similar backgrounds. Why is it that I have faith and they don't? What is it? What's the thing that is the difference between us? And I found I couldn't find a reason for it. So. Anything you want to add? We'll move on to the next step here. I'm cognizant of our time, so.
No, I think I'm good.
All right. Okay. So the next step really flows from the previous one, and I call this the permission to doubt. So the first two stages really happen to you, right? Like tragedy or seeing something, a particular argument that questions some heartfelt belief that you might have. But the permission to doubt phase is a way, it's almost kind of what I just described. I started to read Ebert. I started to occasionally, I'd see an article about atheism, and I would just, those things had been off limits. I wasn't allowed to read those or look at those things, and I just started to check them out. Like, okay, if I think, I literally said this to myself, if my faith is worth anything, it can stand up to scrutiny. So I'm going to scrutinize it. Those are kind of famous last words, I think. And so this permission to doubt phase is kind of beginning to acknowledge that, hey, I have faith, but is there something objective outside of my subjective faith experience that would hold up my reasons for believing in God? Does any of that ring true to you at all?
Yeah, I actually during the crying out phase, I had this thought in my head, and I even met with a pastor about it. I'm like, I feel like I need to go back and reread the Bible with a skeptical mind. And if it's true, then it will stand up to my skepticism, and it'll be clear as day that this is the absolute truth. This is the only way to eternal life. And he kind of raised an eyebrow and didn't really react to that, as I feel like he knew that this was going to be the end response to that journey. And so I did. I picked it up and started reading Mark, because that was probably the first book of the Bible that I ever read straight through, and it was pretty short. So I'm actually doing it again on my blog as a kind of skeptical Bible study, and
Interesting.
putting my notes in there now after the fact. So that's so I had that same, if God is real, he'll be able to withstand my puny mind.
Exactly, right? Yeah, if it's if half of this is true, it should stand up completely to critical a critical look. And yet, spoiler alert, it didn't for you or I. So yeah, so I think this one's kind of self-evident. It's just, there's kind of a letting down of the guard a little bit. Maybe this one's slightly more conscious than the previous two phases of, allowing yourself to explore a little bit and acknowledging that you have serious doubts and that those need to be addressed, right? I think the previous two phases, you're stuffing those doubts down, you're pretending they don't exist. You're trying to believe in the pat answers, and at this point, you're saying, you know what, these doubts have validity on some level, and I need to explore them and figure out what's going on. So, anything you want to add, and we'll move on?
No, I think we can go to deconstruction.
Okay. Here comes the controversial phase. I was really uncomfortable adding this, and yet I felt like if I didn't put it here, I'd be leaving something out. So one of the interesting things for me as I went online, created this graceful atheist persona, and started to make friends online. Some of the earliest friends weren't hardcore atheists. Some of the earliest friends that I made were in this deconstruction process, and I'm probably going to murder the definition of this, but from my perspective, deconstruction is really kind of the removal of fundamentalism from one's faith, right? It's the acknowledgement that Genesis 1 is probably allegorical and not literal. It's the acknowledgement that when the Bible is being figurative, it's to be interpreted figuratively, that everything doesn't have to be literal. I think the word I used was the puerile fundamentalism. What I mean by that is just a childish understanding of Scripture. And what I found as I went online was that there's a huge community of people who are what I would call liberal Christians, right? They've liberalized their theology. They have um, uh, they still believe, they still call themselves Christians, or to be wider than that, believers of other faiths, but um, they've acknowledged kind of the limitations of what their particular scripture can be held up to, right? The idea of inerrancy or absolute authority is kind of acknowledged as being unsustainable, right? There's an acknowledgement that, hey, science may have some important things to say about our lives, and we should acknowledge that. The reason why I say this is maybe controversial is I think there's lots of maybe our atheist followers who are a little more hardcore. Maybe they grew up secular or what have you, and this feels like deconstruction can feel like Richard Dawkins calls this the sophisticated believer, and that is not a compliment, right? I think the hardcore atheists see this as a bit squirrely, right? Like you can't really pin down the sophisticated believer to really engage in a hard debate. So I'm going to acknowledge right off the bat, this wasn't my experience. I did go through parts of that. I think I acknowledged very early on science was a thing and something to be believed. I acknowledged pretty early on, even in my Bible college days, when the Bible is figurative, it should be taken figuratively. And even way back then, I knew that Genesis was not to be taken literally. And so that was always a part of my faith. So it wasn't really a phase that I went through. I just wanted to include it here to acknowledge that that's a real possibility, and that there are many people who remain kind of in this deconstruction phase or as liberal Christians and have something to tell us, right? Like this, I don't think it's a good thing to just reject that perspective, right? So I don't know what your experiences was, but let me know what you think.
Yeah, I went through probably a little bit of that. The church I went to was super liberal to begin with, but there were hard lines. Obviously, like it's religion. There's black and white.
Yes,
I mean, even the pastor I talked to in the same conversation about reading it skeptically, he's like, yeah, there are parts of the Bible, like Genesis. You'll never see me teach on Genesis because it's I don't think that that's exactly how it happened. That kind of blew my mind. I'm like, then why is the rest of it true? Where's the line between what's
that's
literal and what's
so good.
figurative?
That's so good. Say that again. Say it again.
Where's the line between what's figurative and what's literal? That set me off. But I actually have a friend that I went to the church with who's in this deconstruction phase, and his term for it is hopefully skeptical. I was like, all right, that's fair. He's hopeful that this thing is true, but he's skeptical of what's written. I'm like, that's a fair place to be. I've definitely gone further than that, but that's cool. That's where you are.
Right.
But that's all I got.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So again, I wanted to, have that in there as a totally legitimate process to go through. And I love my online friends who are there, they're believers, but they're acknowledging reality to as much as they can. And at the same time, I want to say that, obviously our purposes here are to talk about going all the way. Right. And so we'll just move on very quickly. I call this next one a pseudo phase, because really it's I'm using Ryan Bell's term liminal. Obviously that is a word that exists, but I like the way that he uses it. It's basically this idea of being in between. And I wanted to acknowledge that even though this was not my experience, I had a really dramatic, all those doubts were, growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And up to the very last second, I considered myself a believer. And then all of a sudden I didn't. So it was very quick for me. But I realize that that won't be the case for everyone else. And so this idea of liminal is acknowledging that it's very real possibility that you could waver back and forth, that you could say, I'm a believer one day and the next day think, no, I don't think I am. And for some unknown amount of time, it's possible to not know, to be truly agnostic, to have no position. Does that ring true at all to you, or was that any part of your
experience? I had probably about a month or so of that before I to use your analogy, before I hit the water. There was, like you said, days where I woke up, I'm like, I am a Christian, and then there are days where I'm like, nope, that's not a thing. And I eventually hit that water and went all in. Or all out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, very quickly, just for people that are not actually reading the article but listening, the analogy was about jumping off a diving board. In that, as soon as you lose contact with the diving board, you kind of let go of faith. But until you touch the water, you really aren't a non-believer. You're in some between state, and that was just a poor attempt at describing what it feels like to be there. So I'm glad that rang true for you. So. All right, so if we move on to this is the thing, right? This is where we're leading up to. I call this next phase crossing the Rubicon of faith and doubt, and I really do see this as a line in the sand that happened. My experience was dramatically so. Like, again, minutes before I kind of admitted to myself, I would have said, I'm a believer. I have doubts, but I believe 100%. And 5 minutes later, after just having this oh shit moment, I realized, I'm an atheist. There was just no questioning for me, and it happened like that. Again, I don't expect that everyone's experience will be similar to that, but at some point, the doubts have overwhelmed all of the attempts to hold them at bay, and you acknowledge to yourself that, you know what, I no longer have faith. Was there a moment like that for you? When did you kind of acknowledge to yourself, Chris, that you were an atheist?
Yeah, there was a period of about 6 months where we weren't going to church. We weren't a part of a church, and that's kind of my liminal stage where I'm off and on. But we were invited to a church. My wife was asked to be the godmother of one of her friends. And I'm like, all right, you know what? This is a good thing. I'll go. I'll have an open mind, and it'll be just like old times. And we get there, and we're getting all situated in our seats, and the video announcements come up on the screens, and the first one is, "Come buy our coffee. It's the best this side of the Mississippi." And at that moment, I'm like, this is just another business. They are just here to take people's money, whether it's a conscious thing or not.
Yeah, totally.
and that shattered any illusion, I think, of faith that I had right then and there.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So again, I don't know if we need to talk more about this. There's just a moment in time where you recognize, you admit to yourself, I don't believe, and there may have been, years leading up to that. There may, it could happen in minutes, or it could happen over years period of time. But at some point, you say, I don't believe anymore, and you begin to grapple with that. The next phase, and I'm really aware of we're running out of time here, so I want to jump through these, is about, I call it all the feels. This one, I'm trying to capture the fact that you've just lost a best friend. You've lost your God. You have lost possibly the community that surrounds you. In the worst case scenario, people lose family members. There's a tremendous amount of loss as you acknowledge that you're an atheist, and you move forward with your life past faith, the life after God kind of thing. And what I'm trying to capture here is that there's no wrong way to feel. There's no right way to feel. I quote Brian Peck, who talks about, it's very much the same emotional experience as losing a loved one. Anger, depression, bargaining, all of those things. You might find yourself praying still to say, God, show yourself, please. Like last chance, man, show me. So just a broad range of emotions that you can go through. And a couple that I point out that are kind of unique to this is maybe feeling gullible, having felt that you were gullible in the past and feeling guilty about that. Um, the the loss of a sense of control, like up until this point, you've really had the ability to, when something bad happened or something you didn't, the first thing you could do is go pray. And all of a sudden, that was the feeling that I have the most, was all of a sudden something happens and I go, what do I do? I can't do anything about this. Right. And like, it's just this amazing realization that the world is on its own moving. I think I quote Julia Sweeney saying, who's minding the till here? The thing is, it's going on its own. And it's just a weird mental leap that happens to you. And then finally, I talk about the loneliness. And I think this is part of the reason why Chris and I want to do what we're doing here, is that, you can experience loss of real relationships. And the main thing that I felt was, I am totally alone in this. All of my family are believers. The vast majority of my close friends are believers. Who am I going to talk to about this? And I don't know about you, but even when I would talk to my secular friends, because most of them were secular all their lives, they were like, okay. So it was deeply unsatisfying. I'm like, you don't understand. I just completely changed my entire worldview overnight. This is huge. And they were like, it's like, the only people who understand this are people like you and I who have gone through this process. If you were a serious believer, if you were all the way in, and then you recognize that you no longer believe, that is a dramatic experience that no one else can understand without having gone through it.
Yeah.
What about you,
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, I had I didn't have a whole lot of secular friends to begin with, so that made it really hard. I have I talked to my wife about it, and her response at the time was, well, I was only going because you were going, which
Yeah.
didn't help. But now it's more of a, you're too atheist. I'm like, is that a thing? So
Yeah.
she doesn't really want any part of this whole thing, but it's not like I have to hide it from her. It's just I can't really talk to her about it. So it's hard
Right.
to find someone to have an empathetic talk with, I guess would be
Exactly. And again, I'm very glad that you and I have chatted together and become friends. I think we're becoming friends, like literally in front of the people watching. And I appreciate so much the raw honesty that you showed just in your describing, how you've gone through this, and I deeply appreciate that. So
Yeah.
we'll try not to cry in front of the camera here.
Yeah.
So a lot of feelings is what I'm trying to say. So like, it just, again, it can be an emotional process. So again, I think we're running out of time. So very quickly, next phase, I talk about information gathering. And this is just really, hey, the bridle is off. I can go look at and question anything I want. Read Dawkins, read Hitchens, read Harris, right? Just, you may not be out yet. You may not have told anybody yet, but at this point, you're just figuring it out, right? You're reading more science. You're looking at how other people have gone through this process, and you're realizing that is the realization that, hey, I'm not alone. Many other people have gone through this. Many other people have let go of faith, and some secular thinkers, even if they were always secular, have some very poignant things to say that are meaningful now, and that kind of thing. So, was there a particular book or a blog or anything that really was meaningful for you?
I latched on to the Atheist Experience. It's a show on YouTube. They broadcast once a week. And Matt Dillahunty became kind of a somewhat hero of mine. I mean,
Right.
he had a similar journey. You know, he was a Baptist for so many years and had his he lost his faith, or if you want to call it that. And I binged that so hard for like a month. I went back like 2 years in their archives. It was ridiculous. And then I started reading other stuff. Like street epistemology. I find that very interesting. I'm kind of starting to employ that with some people, which is kind of cool. And I'm currently reading the required atheist reading of The God Delusion. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
You don't get your membership card till you read that. And just so we're clear, that is totally facetious. But, yeah. So yeah, I am a big reader. So like, I read everything I could get my hands on, and that's what I was trying to describe here. And I do think that YouTube channels, blogs, books, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. There's just a lot of sources out there where you can, work through. You can see the secular argument, the atheist argument, and see which. You might even still be in a point where you're kind of comparing and contrasting which one is more valid, and I think that's really important. Just learning. Real quickly, then the second to last step is what I call in and out of the closet. And what I want to make clear here is that, if you're in a cultural environment or societal environment where it would be dangerous for you to come out as an atheist or as a non-believer, non-theist, whatever term you choose, you are under no obligation to tell anybody. And I feel like there's kind of two sides to this, right? It's great if you can come out, if you can tell people. That is good, because then that makes it much more easy for the next person to come out, or to acknowledge their doubts and let go of faith. But if there are social consequences for you, employment, school, what have you, I'd like to just point out, you just don't owe anybody. So find the people that you trust. Or like in the case that what we're experiencing here, just there are people online that you can meet that you realize, hey, this person's telling my story, and I can tell them mine. I can feel safe to tell them, and I know they're gonna, be protective of that. Sometimes, oddly, it's easier to talk to a stranger than it is to someone else. So, who's the first person? Did you tell anybody? Who'd you tell first, and how did that go?
I told my wife, and she was like, "Oh, that's fine, whatever." I'm kind of still in that in and out of the closet phase. I told a couple people I used to go to church with that I was really close with, had pretty positive responses. I think one is confused between being an atheist and doubting, but that's for him to work out. I'm not here to define his terms for him.
Right.
And the other, he was a different pastor at the church. He had moved a few states away, and we stayed in close contact. We were good friends before he moved, and I shared my blog with him. I didn't really give him any kind of heads up. I was just like sent him a link, and he responded. He goes, "Thanks for sharing this with me. I'm not here to preach to you or try to reconvert you. I may bring up points every now and then," and I'm like, "That's what I want. I want to be challenged. I don't want to live in an echo chamber anymore. I did that already. I need someone to give me a different point of view all the time."
Right.
So, and then I created the Godless Journey persona as well, just so I can write freely without any expectation back on me for explanation. I can just word vomit on the internet.
It's venting. It's like I get to vent by writing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very quickly, I told my wife, who is very much a believer, and I think that was a pretty painful experience for her, and it's still a sore subject. I told my best friend, who is still very much a believer, and everyone was good about it. Nobody, got super angry or yelled at me or anything. But basically, my family and friends that are believers just studiously ignore the fact that I'm an atheist, right? Until it comes up, and then they have to address it. You can see the deer in the headlights look in their eyes is like, what are we going to say? What are we going to do? So yes, and then I think finding, podcasts about other believers that have gone through deconversion and become atheists was just really important to recognize that, okay, other people go through this, and it's not just me. So yeah. So just to sum up that, if you can come out, that's fantastic. Do so as much or as little as you want. If there's any social consequence that you're not ready to pay, take your time. There's just no time. There's no ticking time bomb. You can stay in the closet for as long as you want, and that may be contrary to the other advice that you might get. So anyway, so our last phase is about now what? What do we do now? And what I was trying to capture here is that we had a moral framework that was given to us. You might say stuffed down your throat. You have a kind of a worldview, and these things are just presented as, take it, or else. And all of a sudden you feel totally responsible for yourself, for your family, for the world, right? And for me, humanism captures some of what it means for me to have a moral framework, to my obligations to other people, to ground something that I call secular grace. This idea of loving people, why I think that's necessary. But whatever you come to, it's a discovery process, and I like to talk about the freedom that you have now to go figure out what is it you believe and why, and where do your morals come from, and that's an exciting discovery process. So how do Chris, what would you describe as your kind of after some of these things have gone by, you start to think, what is it beyond? Because really atheism just says I don't believe in gods. It really doesn't say anything else, right? So what is next? What's next for you? What is important to you?
I think I'm still working through that. I'm having a hard. I hesitate to put a label on myself at this point, having been labeled for so long. Like things like morality, I struggle back and forth. Is there a universal morality where you just know something's right or wrong, and it just is because of what it is, or is it subjective because it's different in every situation? So I'm still kind of working through a lot of that stuff. And your blog here, one question is, where do I find meaning? That one was a lot easier for me to parse out. Meaning is the meaning of me is what I make of it. There is no grand scheme of all these little pieces working together. The meaning of my life is how I define my life. So that's yeah. So I'm still working through a lot of that, but
well, and I think that's a lifelong process.
True.
Yeah, I don't want to imply ever that these things are just quick. I think the rest of our lives will be figuring that out. And that sounds like maybe a good hangout topic for one of the next rounds.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So just to wrap up, what I think, if I can speak for Chris, I think what we want out of this is not for just two guys to be talking to each other, but to maybe have this be the seed of the beginning of a community. We are looking for other people to participate. I think if Chris agrees that we will continue to do these kind of off and on, we'll do his blog post, my blog post, what have you, and try to work these things out live in front of a camera. And if people want to join us, then that's what we're really aiming at. More than just us talking, we're really looking for people to who want to tell us their deconversion story. We want to listen. So that's really where we're at. You can contact us on our blogs. Let's give them for the people here. Mine is gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Chris, what's yours?
Godlessjourney.com.
Excellent. You can find us on Twitter. I'm at Graceful Atheist. And
At
Chris?
Godless Journey.
Excellent. So we want to hear from you. Get in contact with us, and otherwise we'll see you soon.
Take care, all.
Bye-bye.